Hello there and welcome to Corey's Datapad for another Mandalorian episode breakdown. Just like with the previous episodes, we're going to start with some quick spoiler-free thoughts before jumping into the full breakdown, talking about everything that happened. So far, this was my favorite episode of the series. A lot of people were putting episode 1 of season 2, or chapter 9, whichever you prefer, as the best episode so far for them, and while I really did enjoy that one, I wouldn't really have put it as a definitive best one. It's definitely in contention, but I feel like if I went back and through, I might put the finale or the premiere of season 1 ahead of it. And I think with this episode, I was pretty sure it was my favorite the whole way through. We get a lot of backstory and a lot of context for what the Mandalorian is doing I don't want to get into spoilers too much, but this is probably one of the more important episodes plot-wise that we've ever seen. And I really enjoyed a lot of the visuals for this episode. There were some ship and vehicle appearances, which doesn't really give anything away, but just the way that the show has developed visually, I think, is fantastic. We are going to jump into the specific information from the episode now, so if you haven't seen the episode yet, definitely go watch it, or if you don't care, keep watching here, but spoiler time. So the episode opens with showing the final bits of the Mandalorian's task to bring the mother and her eggs to her partner on the planet of Trask, which is full of Mon Calamari and Corran. It's basically just Mon Calamari, but a different planet. So I assume it's some sort of like Mon Cal and Corran colony planet. But we finally meet the Mandalorian contact that the Mandalorian Din has been chasing for the last 3 episodes, and it turns out to be Bo-Katan. Before we get to that though, we get a cool shot as the Mandalorian is coming in, crashing onto Trask, of the vehicle with the crane on its back, and it's kind of like an AT-AT, but I thought this looked really cool, and on that topic, the Gozanti that they end up boarding was also phenomenal. Like, we did something very similar in the RPG tabletop series that I've been doing with Captain Shack, Eckhart's Ladder, Charlie, and Wasted Space. And this was, in a lot of ways, just little bits of that, seeing that on the screen. And it really does just reinforce the idea that, in a lot of ways, The Mandalorian is kind of just like watching a tabletop campaign and tabletop characters doing tabletop quests in really high production quality. And it's visually some of the best stuff we've seen in Star Wars outside of movies, which it matches movie quality. The stuff they've been able to do visually in the series has just been fantastic. But plot-wise, this episode sets up some really important things that I think are going to continue to be themes throughout the rest of The Mandalorian, not just this season, but stuff that we're going to be dealing with for as long as the show is running. There are some elements that tie into what we got with Boba Fett in episode 1, and I think how that's going to play into what's going on here. There is basically the idea within the show of finding a group that accepts you, or accepting the group you're in. I think the show is almost trying to set up a parallel between the Mandalorians and how foundlings fit into that, like Din himself, and then the Jedi and them being a group with a defined creed and code, but also being made up of kind of adopted members rather than being necessarily a species. And that kind of gets to why when the Mandalorian thinks, I'm going to bring the child back to his kind, he's not thinking the Yoda species, he's thinking the Jedi. Because to him, he is part of this group that's been accepted, and that is what he means by their kind. Like, he would think of his kind as the Mandalorians and not humans. He thinks of the child's kind as the Jedi because that's all he knows of Force sensitives, rather than necessarily thinking primarily of the species. And I think this is something that it may be a little disappointing for people because it probably means we're not going to the planet of the Yodas, but we're going to see 2 sides of that with the Mandalorian, and maybe he gives up the child and that we don't keep the child as part of the show eventually. When he ultimately gets to Ahsoka, we'll see what happens there, but I hope the child doesn't leave the show, and I hope that stays involved, but that would probably come with a chance of the Mandalorian being more tied up in other issues outside of Mandalorians, and I'm not sure how we feel about that. I will say I was worried earlier on in the series, and I think I spoke about this in my first episode review, about how they would handle some of the character cameos we heard about. So we already had Boba Fett enter, and now we have Bo-Katan, and we have Ahsoka. Ahsoka was the one that specifically worried me. Bo-Katan I thought made sense, Boba I thought kind of made sense, but now we're kind of seeing Boba Fett representing one side of Mandalorians that the Mandalorian doesn't agree with, and Bo-Katan as another side of a similar idea, where Boba Fett within the new canon isn't really Mandalorian, but Din has to kind of come to terms with what it will mean for a non-Mandalorian to wear the armor. And we see him do that with someone he respects, with Cobb Vanth, and maybe we'll get a different side of that with Boba Fett going forward. But in the group that Bo-Katan runs, I don't know if they're specifically still classified as the Night Owls or if they're just her own members of the Mandalorian, since she would technically be Mandalore. We get to see a different side from the Mandalorian culture that Din has been brought up in, which turns out to be essentially Death Watch. He's very offended by them removing their helmets and essentially calls them fake Mandalorians. So we're going to see how he interacts with that culture a bit more. Bo-Katan initially kind of takes advantage of him and mocks his position on what she's doing, but by the end of the episode, Din kind of respects what Bo-Katan's doing a bit more and sees that her and her companions are, in a lot of ways, still a part of this tradition that he's carrying on, even though they have certain different practices that they're not adhering to that he would consider being the only way, the only part of the Mandalorian creed. So we'll probably see a bit more of the differences between Satine and Bo-Katan's version of the Mandalorians versus Death Watch and what their ideas are as the show progresses, and I think that'll become an increasingly large part of the show. But those are my thoughts for the week. There was also something really weird and kind of cool about seeing some of the characters that were from a show like Rebels and the Clone Wars, especially the Clone Wars, which in its earlier seasons was the kind of cartoon violence versus live action violence, and just seeing Bo-Katan stab a stormtrooper through the throat multiple times. That was something. But I don't want to go too deep here. Hope you guys have enjoyed this recap of the episode. Hopefully we'll be able to do more of the full in-depth episode reviews on Tapcaf Transmissions when Ek is back on duty. But let me know what you guys think about how the show is shaping up, and hope to see you next time. Have a good one.